I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Oh Sinners is one of the best books I've read this year. And yes, I'm taping this in March, and the book is coming out shortly. But honestly, I have now flown through this book twice. And Nicole Cuffy, it's her second novel. The first one was Dances, which I also enjoyed, but Oh Sinners, yeah, I am wildly in love with this book, and I'm so happy we get to talk about it. Nicole, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
So, three narratives. One present day, one Vietnam in 1969, and one sort of early mid-aughts in Texas, right? Do I have the timeline right?
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, we're spoiler-free in this conversation, and you and I were just chatting through some stuff before we started taping, but I love the way the three stories are laid out. I love this cast of characters, which is really tight, considering that you're covering like 50 some odd years.
Yeah.
And three different places, like wildly different. I need to know where this book started for you, because this was not what I was expecting as a follow-up to Dances.
Yeah, very different book from Dances.
But I just, like I said, I'm wildly in love with Oh Sinners. And Dances is great too. It's just a very, very different reading experience. So can we just talk about how this book started?
Yeah, definitely. So this book kind of started not necessarily with the Vietnam War, but definitely with the Vietnam War era. It really kind of happened randomly. I was just watching a show, and the song that happened to play while I was watching this show was Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son, which was a song that I had heard before, but I had never really paid that much attention to it. And so I heard it on this show, and I actually paid attention to it and was just kind of struck by how much it sounded like the time that it came out in. Like, it just sounded like the late 60s to me. It sounded angry. It sounded like that youthful protest that is so often associated with Americans during the Vietnam War. And so in listening to the song kind of opened the gateway to all of the other protest music that came out popularly during the time. And as I started listening to a lot of this music, I started to think to myself, like, I don't really know that much about the Vietnam War specifically. I knew like a few key points. Like I knew enough to know that depending on where you are in the United States, you're either taught that the war was lost by the United States or that nobody won, which I think is interesting. So I wanted to do some more research there. And, a lot of what I know about the era comes from my parents, who were adolescents during this time. And, as Black folks growing up in the Bronx and Brooklyn and New York, they were mostly preoccupied with what was happening in those locations. So sort of going into the very, very early stages of the crack epidemic, the housing crisis with, the projects were burning in the Bronx all the time. That's where my mom was, the rise of hip hop and rap. Like, these were the things that they were concerned about. I never really heard them talk about the Vietnam War or seeing anybody go off to war or anything like that. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. And so as I started researching, I just got really fascinated by not only what happened during the Vietnam War, but also the sort of disparate responses from American youth to the Vietnam War, because we're sort of like in the heat, sort of reaching the crescendo or at the crescendo of the civil rights movement in the United States. We have sort of this dual response from Black Americans. Like, on the one hand, you have Black soldiers who are being sent disproportionately to the front lines in the Vietnam War, who aren't being really told what they're fighting for. While at the same time, back home here in the United States, you have Black men and Black civil rights activists being assassinated. We have the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. while there are Black soldiers on the ground in Vietnam, and just kind of looking at what the responses were. And what I was seeing was a lot of youthful anger, justifiable anger. And as I was looking at that, I started to ask myself sort of the central question of this book started to form, which is, what can anger do to somebody? What does that rage do if it's not checked, if it's not treated, if it's never met with any kind of justice? And so the answer to that forms my cult leader, Odo, which is that rage can sort of physiologically and psychologically mutilate you. It makes you into something, or can make you into something that sort of enacts that trauma onto other people, which is what our cult leader is doing. And then I kind of apply that same question to our journalist, Farouk, who is also angry, who has also been disenfranchised and treated unfairly on the basis of race and other marginalized identities that he holds. And for him, it doesn't turn him into what Odo is, but it turns him into this sort of self-flagellating, constantly hypercritical of his self person who won't even allow himself the space to grieve. And so then, we have these two traumatized individuals meeting each other and kind of seeing what happens as a result of their respective traumas.
And grief is a big part of both of their stories. And because they are who they are, Oda and Farouk, they're not really good at acknowledging the grief.
Right.
And in some cases, they're barely able to acknowledge the rage, right? Which I find completely fascinating. Because to me, I mean, we have such funky conversations about grief in our culture, right? Like, in a lot of ways, we don't know how to talk about grief, right? People are completely freaked out about it. And grief and rage really run on parallel tracks, right? Like, does the rage inform the grief or does the grief inform the rage? And I don't think you can actually separate the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of why I was so into O Sinners, because the other thing is too, Oda is so seductive.
Right.
Like, it is, I absolutely understand how this guy started a cult. Like, I am extremely clear on how he starts his cult, because he's able to give people what they want to hear.
Right.
And it's wild to me as we meet the folks, and it's not a huge cast, but they're very distinct. And the people that we do meet who sort of rotate in and out of, wait for it, the Forbidden City, which I'm sorry, made me laugh. It still makes me laugh. It's a great idea for the name of a compound, but watching people at different levels of their experience of the nameless,
right,
how they interact with him. And then we get Farouk. And obviously Farouk is our stand-in.
Right.
I really like him as a character. I totally bought into his whole up and down, back and forth. He's grieving his dad, yes, but he's grieving a lot more than that.
Yes, he is. He's still actively grieving his mother as well as perhaps his relationship to faith in general, as well as his specific family's faith. Yeah, he's, I think, quite sad, but isn't able to fully acknowledge that himself.
So when did you find Oda's voice and when did you find Farouk's voice? Because, I mean, that intersection of these two, and they're like 30 years apart in age, and yet, it's like holding up a mirror in a way, right? Like, yeah. Honestly, I could see Farouk maybe not starting a cult per se, but starting some kind of movement. Like, he's got the charisma to do it. He may be a little off to the side, but they're really interesting characters, and it's a really interesting pairing.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's kind of interesting to sort of look for those parallels between what it takes to be a cult leader and kind of anything else. Like, speaking to Farouk's charisma, that's something that he needs as the kind of journalist, like the kind of investigative journalist that he is. And so, yeah, he absolutely, if he had the inclination, could leverage that to get people to follow him. But yeah, I would say that Odo's voice came to me first. He was more familiar to me as sort of a character, as this, charismatic, energetic, older Black man. Like, this is someone that I have encountered before in my own community. So he was easier rather for me to sort of form. And I just kind of had such a clear vision of what his energy was like. He really kind of sprung forth from the music itself, especially as I'm listening to like Marvin Gaye and Sam Cooke. Like, he's a child of that genre of music is what I was imagining. So he was, I also was able to sort of create this lexicon around him, because part of what he does is he picks up like mannerisms and language from kind of everybody that he encounters. So, I'm thinking about some of the language that was popular during the Vietnam War era, what dapping meant during the Vietnam War, as well as throwing in some very butchered, almost unrecognizably so, Vietnamese words that he kind of co-opts and appropriates and then repurposes it to nefarious means. So he was kind of fun to put together as a voice, because I knew where his voice came from. It's not even really his voice. He's like a magpie, he just kind of collects these things and then regurgitates them in a new way. Farouk, I kind of thought of as a sort of just, I kind of thought of him as thinking of himself as just kind of a guy, like just a guy.
Yeah. No, totally. I get that.
Yeah. And I had someone ask me, like, when did I decide to write from the male perspective? And I really kind of didn't. It just happened that way. Farouk was just kind of who he was. And I think his voice really came together most solidly once I started really kind of forming his grief. Like, what is driving him? What is it doing to him? How does it move him forward?
Also, the aunties. He has to contend with a bevy of aunties, and anyone who has grown up with a bevy of aunties knows that he is unprepared. He's fully, he's actually more prepared for the cult leader and like his career in media and everything else. But the aunties, he's just like, what is happening here? Which it's nice to have those moments too of humor because, I mean, if you think about the Vietnam War for a minute, like the literature of Vietnam, the histories of Vietnam, it is class. It hits every single point of American class relations, and all of the bad stuff that comes with that, right? It was fought primarily by Black and brown soldiers and what poor white men, like
Right.
the constant exemptions for people who were at places like Yale or, for instance, I went to a college that did away with grade point averages so that boys would not be drafted, which
Wow.
I'm good with that. They have grades now, they have GPAs now, but I mean, the idea that a school would be like, yeah, you can't take these kids because they're babies and we're just going to do away with GPAs so you can't draft them. All props to that. But it was something that people hadn't experienced in America before, like sort of being on the receiving end of a guerrilla war where they're just like, please get out.
Right.
Please don't be here.
Right.
And, this idea that somehow we were fighting China throughout Southeast Asia, like, no, these kids didn't know. And when we meet these soldiers, right, so we've got Preach, we've got Bigger, we've got Silk, and we've got Crazy Horse. And we never learn sort of the names that are on their driver's licenses or their pass. We just know their in-country soldier names.
Right.
And you do this very cool thing where each time I was like, oh, that must be who Odo started as. And I was delightfully surprised when I finally figured out who it was. I was like, oh, because I mean, just the way you meet these guys and what they're going through and how they're responding to it and how they're responding to their fellow soldiers. There's also this kid called Ned.
Yes.
We meet in Vietnam. And Ned is a very sweet guy. And you're like, oh, that's kind of adorable. And Ned gets a nice ending. He really does. But meeting these guys and watching them respond to the world and trying to puzzle out who becomes this guy. It took a little bit. The first time I read it, I was completely shocked. And even the second time when I knew how things were playing out, I was like, oh, right. Oh, right. So can we talk about structuring? Because you flip between the three different periods. Each period gets its own sort of chapter and narrator. And actually the parts that take place in Texas are told in the form of a transcript from a documentary, which I love that device.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about these men, and you sort of alluded to it, like this was your entry point into the story, but these four guys are so fabulous and distinct, and I'm like, wait a minute, what just happened here? What is going on?
It's so funny because I had this anxiety when I'd finished my first draft that it was very, very obvious which of the four soldiers was going to end up being the cult leader. And so every time I get feedback that it's not obvious and that I'm like, oh, okay, good. But yeah, I mean, I just thought about like, I read a lot of whatever firsthand accounts that I could get from specifically Black soldiers who had fought in the Vietnam War. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting and so inspiring was I guess not quite development is not quite the right word for what I'm trying to say, but I guess maybe continuation of Black culture over in the ground on Vietnam, which I just think is so interesting and sort of speaks to some of the things that I love most about my own Blackness is just how, Black people will Black wherever we go. And I love that. So when we think about like dapping somebody or like dapping somebody up, that starts in the Vietnam War. And it starts because Black soldiers, wanted a way to sort of speak to each other while in the first fully desegregated army in American history. So while sort of in enemy territory, they wanted a way to sort of speak to each other, which is a tradition that is quite ongoing in Black culture, from the way that we do our hair to speak to each other to creating quilts. There's always a way that Black people are trying to speak to other Black people without an outside gaze. We're always trying to create closed cultural traditions, and then they get appropriated, but that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, so it starts that way with the dapping. And then also, one of the things that I found so fascinating was the camaraderie between Black soldiers and Vietnamese civilians and other Vietnamese soldiers, whether they were on the opposing side or with, the non-opposing side, the allied side. Which I thought was so interesting, because one of the things that I read from multiple firsthand accounts from Black soldiers was that they kind of all recognize, like, hey, we're both being marginalized by the US government here. We're kind of both experiencing the same thing. So even though technically when we get out into the battlefield and we're fighting against each other, we both sort of recognize that there is this kinship between us. And so, you see Black soldiers learning the Vietnamese language instead of sort of abhorring it and coming up with more and more creative slurs, which is what a lot of other soldiers did. And we also see, dapping sort of being, we also see the sharing of food traditions, which happens, which is, why South Korea makes such good fried chickens, because of the soldiers during World War II, I believe it was. Soldiers came over.
It's actually the Korean War, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
War, that's right.
It was American soldiers, without a doubt, that brought all of that. Korean army stew.
I love that, like that sharing of culture that way, even in times of conflict. So I wanted to explore that through these 4 Black soldiers that are the center of the Vietnam section narrative. And so, yeah, that's kind of where those 4, Bigger, Silk, Crazy Horse, and Preach come from, is these Black soldiers who are very, very young. They're all about, 18 to 20. They're kids, basically. And they're over there literally fighting for their lives and for each other's lives. I mean, for a cause that they don't understand, that they don't necessarily align themselves with. I believe almost like all of them are not there by choice. Most of them got drafted. And so, yeah, I mean, just really exploring the continuation of Black culture in Vietnam through Black soldiers, as well as the relationships between Black soldiers and Vietnamese civilians and Black soldiers and their white counterparts, because that was also very complicated during the Vietnam War.
Oh, you covered so much ground in those chapters. But also, honestly, when I think about it too, like watching the friendship between the 4 soldiers, that core group, but watching them learn to be friends and respect each other. And it's not just about their survival on the battlefront, but like they genuinely like each other, even when they kind of don't. And it was really refreshing, because, I wish we saw sort of more novels about friendship under lots of different circumstances. I mean, Sarah Thankam Mathews did that in her novel, It Could All Be Different. But I would love to see it, because we kind of keep limiting friend. It's like, here's childhood and here's teenagers or whatever. And watching these young men in this particular pressure cooker situation figure out what friendship means to them. I mean, essentially, it keeps them alive.
Right.
In ways that they didn't. None of these 4 would have met if you had not written these like they never they come from very different backgrounds and places and everything else, and they just never would have met. And yet they really each become a piece of the other. And it's very cool to see it sort of unfurl.
Right. Yeah. I mean, friendship is so hard to write about, because as an adult, like I have friends and I don't know how we became friends. So if I can't figure out how I became friends with my friends, how am I supposed to write about how other adults become friends? It's hard.
Yeah, no, it totally is. But it's really fertile territory, especially when you're sort of putting it up against the relationships between all of the members of the Nameless.
Mm-hmm.
Should we call them cult? Let's call them cult members. When you look at the relationships for all of the cult members and how they engage, not just with Odo, but also with themselves and with Farouk, because Farouk ends up, he's like, I do this immersive journalism thing. I'm going to show up. I'm going to live here. I'm going to be part of this thing and like tell the story. And you put him in some pretty thorny situations.
Yeah.
Lots of different thorny situations, but the tenor of the humanity never changes, right? Like everyone's in a pressure cooker. Everyone's trying to figure out what, let's call it enlightenment, looks to them, right? Like, because Oda's going to speak to everyone, and Farouk's like, I'm not I'm not going to succumb to this. I'm not going to succumb to this.
Right.
And yet. So how do you build a cult?
It is scarily easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
Basically what I did is I did a lot of research into basically all major religions, and also looked into like secular research on religion in general, and was able to learn that religions basically have the same structure. They all have these 8 components, which include things like anthropology, cosmetology, cultic practices, right? All religions have these components. And so once I found that structure, basically all I did was kind of just write out the nameless religion in my little notebook and just filled in those 8 components. So like, here is the theology of the nameless. Here are their cultic practices. And so once I did that, I mean, it was there, that was basically the religious text, to tell you the truth. Like, I had like their origin story written out and everything. All of their 18 utterances, which is effectively their ethics, which,
right.
Like 10 commandments or the yamas and niyamas, it's kind of all the same thing. Yeah. So once I had that written out, I had a religion. I've kind of joked with people that if I was maybe more charismatic, I could probably start this cult, because it is seductive. And I think that was one of my other central things that I was exploring in this book. Is Farouk is kind of all of us, in the sense that he really believes, before going out into the redwoods to be with the nameless, to investigate them, that he is immune to this cult, that there's nothing that anyone, especially not Odo, could say to him that would be seductive enough to pull him in. And then he gets there, and he is in fact seduced, as I, hopefully as the reader a little bit. Like, I think that was one of the things that I was looking to explore as I was researching cults, is not so much like what makes someone join a cult. I think that answer to that question is kind of boring. The answer to the question is that people join cults because they're looking for something that the cult gives them the illusion of having. And it's the same answer every time. But what was more interesting to me as far as questions around cults is, A, what is the cult leader doing? Like, does he actually believe what he's saying? Does he start off believing what he's saying or not, and then slowly begins to believe it? Like, what are the motivations behind being a cult leader? And also, like, all of us, I think, have this belief about ourselves that we are immune to joining a cult. And part of it is because when we hear about cults, we're hearing about them in their most extreme form. So we're hearing about Jonestown after the mass suicide. We're hearing about Manson after the murders happen. And so when we see those things, we're like, well, I would never do that. Like, there's nothing that could compel me to, hurt myself or to hurt other people, or to believe that I'm actually an alien who is here on Earth to, I don't know, teach humans peace. Like, whatever it is, whatever the extreme belief is, we all think that we're immune to it. But one of the things that we have to remember about cults is they never start you with the extreme belief. They start you with something that feels really reasonable. And the other thing to remember about cults is that they don't always get to that an extreme belief. Sometimes it does feel like it's reasonable. Like, oh no, we're just here to build a more peaceful world. And that sounds good to, I think, a lot of people. And so all of us are really susceptible to, if not a full-blown cult, then certainly culty things. I'm sure all of us have some extreme belief somewhere, or have been involved with an organization that was cult-like, if not a full-blown cult. I know that I have. I haven't been a nameless follower, but, I was a part of a yoga studio that certainly was very culty at some point. So, I think it's really common, but people don't realize it is. And that's what makes cults dangerous more than anything else. Most cults are not going to result in death and mayhem. Most of them are not, harmful cults in that sense. But a lot of them are harmful psychologically. A lot of them are harmful financially. A lot of them are harmful in the sense that they have a charismatic leader who they've empowered to commit, sexual abuse against people, or psychological or financial abuse against people, right? They can be harmful in those ways. And I think the more that we all sort of recognize that the seduction is very powerful for all of us, because we're all human, the safer maybe we will all be.
But we're also living in a moment, too, where loneliness is endemic. Mm-hmm. Isolation is endemic. And I know yes, you can argue, well, the internet has made everything deliverable and you can get the world on your doorstep and da da da. But actually, it's not entirely true. And I think it does. You've got a character, Min An, who is a filmmaker and also a dancer who's part of the Nameless. And, she is clearly committed to the Nameless and she is clearly committed to Odo. And yet she's still wrestling with perfection in a very sort of odd moment in her life. And you're just kind of like, oh. And it makes perfect sense for the character. It makes perfect sense. Like, it all makes sense. And at the same time, part of me was like, I'm so sorry you're still wrestling with that one particular thing. Because it would seem like that should be, you should be able to not be a perfectionist when you join a cult. Like, isn't that one of those worldly things you should be able to leave behind, right?
Yeah.
And yet you're human no matter where you go. And I think it's so possible and probable. And I think we've all seen it too in our communities where people have kind of tipped over into a thing where they just want to believe that one thing because somehow it feels safer.
Right.
Or at least you don't feel alone. And I'm like, but actually it still doesn't make sense, but okay.
Yeah.
And I think we're all wrestling with that. And that's part of why reading O Sinners, for me at least, being able to watch other people wrestle through it on the page, and I still get to kind of lurk. Like, it's not me. I'm totally invested in these characters and I'm totally invested in the story, but this is a way for me to sort of watch this unfolding of actually, it's also like a collision of cultures.
Yeah.
And that intersection, collision, however you want to describe it, because all of it was surprising. Like, I never felt like suddenly I was like, well, of course. I was always kind of like, oh man. So that happened.
Yeah.
Did you surprise yourself while you were writing this book?
I think maybe not so much, only because I am very much a detailed outliner. So I know pretty much what's happening, as in that the detailed outline is not set in stone. Things can change. I can scrap it if I need to. But even those changes are still along the same sort of continuum that I established when I write the detailed outline. If anything, if there was like I wouldn't call it surprise. It was more like different levels of immersion. Like, there were parts of this book that in writing kind of sucked me in to an experience more than others. Like, one of them is like the horses. Like, I was fully absorbed as I was writing notes, fully doing research in public, by the way, with video. So who knows what
Sorry.
we're like looking over my shoulder, like, why is she watching back-to-back videos of horses giving birth? But yeah, it just like fascinated and really got into that, and also really got into the battle component of war, which is, I guess that is surprising for me because I'm very much like I don't like that stuff. Like, I don't even like it when I'm watching a movie. Like, I'll zone out a little bit, not because it's so off put, but just because it's just not super interesting to me. I'm a pacifist at heart. I don't like people fighting. Also, I think there are only so many ways to portray violence before it becomes redundant. So I was surprised that I was able to sort of sink into those moments of battle the way that I was. And I think that really came from really reading and speaking to soldiers who were able to explain to me that it feels like it lasts for a long time, but it's really so quick. Like, these moments. I was like, oh, okay, this doesn't have to last for pages and pages and pages.
Well, and I think, too, it brings me back to emotional violence versus physical violence, right? And that parallel, because, again, like, as you said earlier, Odo is Odo.
Yes. Yeah.
Odo's Odo. And he does use people's trauma against them. He does. I'm really trying not to give some stuff away is really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you look at what he experienced as a very young man, there's a layer of context that we can't ignore because, I mean, he's also not a guy who's going to get home from Vietnam and suddenly go into therapy. That isn't what happened.
Right.
Soldiers came back. The country was not happy with them.
Right.
Soldiers went through really rotten stuff. And in some cases came back to abject poverty and, drug addiction. It was a shocking moment for a lot of people in American history, right? So the idea that Odo would end up in suburbia with a lawn and running to the dump and all that kind of like that was never going to be his trajectory.
Right.
And so here we're meeting him where he's created this empire.
Yeah.
And you drop these hints in. So the third section, the narrative, this transcript of a documentary.
Right.
Odo has suddenly decided they're going to pick up stakes and go to Texas. This is sort of between Vietnam and Northern California. And he ends up squaring off against the pastor of an evangelical church.
Right.
And these men are not so different. And the reader understands that these men are not so different. These men do not understand that they are not so different. Right. Oh, the men do not understand. And you do a lot of clever stuff with the transcript. But I also liked having the format just to sort of break up the story and make it really clear that we are in a different moment in history and a different moment in Odo's development and whatnot. When did you decide that that's how you had to tell that part of the story that way? And again, I'm dancing around spoilers.
Yeah, I mean, I was really excited to tell that part of the story that way. I actually had no experience in script writing whatsoever, so sort of learned how to do that from scratch using like this software that I found for script writing, which kind of like helped walk me through it, as well as Interior Chinatown was really helpful in
Love that book.
Like, do that in a way that is readable for people.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I also I think part of the reason I was so excited to write that in that way is it was going to allow me to incorporate music, which I do in footnotes in that documentary section, because I really wanted to share like sort of the musical experience of this book. And that documentary script allowed me to do that. And I was also just really interested because I was doing all of this research into religion in like the intersection of religion as far as faith is concerned, as well as religion as far as scholarship is concerned, and how those two things might meet each other like on the ground when we're dealing with actual people. We're outside of our books, we're outside of our universities. Like what happens when we have those things clash in real life? And that's kind of what happens in that documentary section is, that conflict is there. So yeah, that's kind of where that came from. I also, in doing research for cults for this book, watched a lot of documentaries about cults. Like a lot of them. So it also that there were a few documentaries that really inspired that particular narrative.
The dialogue across all three sections of the story is fantastic. There's a snap crackle thing that happens with it, and it's really deeply satisfying, especially when we're in the transcript part, because there is one character your readers will meet, and self-awareness is not really his greatest strength. Let's put it that. And I realize I'm saying this about a side character in a novel about a cult leader, but our friend is not. He thinks he's much more self-aware than he, in fact, is. Even considering everything that's happening as you're reading the story, I don't think he understands that he's a little bit of comic relief.
Yeah, you're right. Right.
I think he does not understand, but it is fun to read. But I want to talk about structure for a second. You do have an MFA, you teach writing, and have taught writing for a while. And I know you said at the top of the show, you were like, well, I'm glad to know that you couldn't figure out which of the soldiers becomes Odo until, you do find out, but,
yes.
And it's a very satisfying reveal. But structuring this the way you could have gone any number of ways. The structure works really well. This is the second book you've done with your editor. I'm just wondering if we can talk about process for a second, talk about the actual craft, because clearly you are someone who thinks on a sentence level. And again, this brings me back to the dialogue, because I'm just like, it's so sharp and it's so funny and it's so smart. But I do want to talk about process, and I'm not entirely sure where to start because there's a lot of ground to cover in that.
Yeah, as far as structure is concerned, I think, I understood what I wanted to sort of explore. I knew that I wanted to explore this question of religion and what is the line between a religion that is recognized as such and a cult. And I also knew that I wanted to talk about this specific fictional cult. And I also wanted to explore the nature of disenfranchisement. Like, what does it do to you to sort of live under a state of oppression in an otherwise free society. What does that do to somebody? And so I think that's kind of where the structure came from. I was like, I do this in 3 sections is how I do this. And so, in thinking about these 3 sections, I was so excited to talk about the Vietnam War. I'm still excited to talk about it. If anyone wants to nerd out with me about the Vietnam War, call me. I'm still excited to talk about this. I'm so fascinated. But yeah, so that section kind of happened because, I really wanted to explore the perspective of these Black soldiers who were young and fighting this war in foreign land while there's this other war being fought back at home that is, specifically pertaining to them just not being able to participate in sort of the civil rights struggle here in the United States because they had been pulled out and sort of dropped here more or less to die. That's kind of what we were doing so that we can prevent the spread of communism, which, didn't work. And then, I also knew that I wanted to explore this perspective from Farouk, somebody who also is experiencing marginalization and oppression and discrimination in the United States in a way that is similar but different from the way that a Black man would experience in the United States, and also dealing with this massive grief that he's sort of grappling with. And then, the documentary script, I was just so fascinated again by my research into religions and extreme belief that this felt like the best. I dropped a scholar in there because I wanted to talk from that scholarly perspective because I just thought that stuff was so fascinating. And I wanted people to ask themselves that question, like, what is the difference really between a religion and a cult? Is a cult really just a religion in its infancy? Like, at what point do we sort of stop calling things cults and calling them religions? If we think of cult as sort of this derogatory term, and religion is, the loftier, the thing that we aspire to be, like, what is the difference really? And, I was also, like I said, really inspired by the documentaries about cults that I was consuming in bulk at the time.
I mean, it's wild to me listening to you talk about how much research went into the novel. I never felt like you were feeding me a polemic, and I never felt like I was reading something that someone had done their homework for. I was like, this is a story I don't want to let go of. I cannot believe I'm hanging out with these people. I cannot get enough of these people who, I mean, that's the beauty of a book, right? Like, if I'd wanted to, I could have put it down at any point and been like, I'm going to go get a snack and come back to this. And I was like, both times I read it straight through in a single sitting. And this is a 400 plus page book. This is not 125 pages. And I was like, I cannot get enough of also the narrative tension and the forward movement. It's wild how quickly this book reads to me. And I realize I just said wild twice now, but the experience of reading O Sinners is not, it's a very original experience for me. Being able to sit down and say, well, yeah, no, it flew both times. Because you're reading really differently when you're reading just for the sake of the read, and then you're reading to prep for a show. You're like, oh, these characters, man, this is just wild. But since we've talked about research, can we talk about literary influences too? Because I feel like you're pulling from lots of different places, and you have an MFA. So clearly there is a lot of reading and writing that has happened to get us to this point. But I'm just wondering if we can shout out Beyond Interior Chinatown, which is also a novel I love, Charles Yu.
Yeah,
like, he can do all of the things, and I'm waiting desperately for a new novel, but I'm going to sit quietly over here.
Yeah, I mean, aside from Interior Chinatown, I mean, a lot of the literature that I pulled from or that I really consumed came from either Vietnam vets who were writing from like memoir, basically, or who were writing fictional books based on their own experiences. Like The Things They Carried was a huge, what a beautiful, I don't even know what to call it, because it's technically a collection of stories, but there is sort of this unifying thread throughout that makes it sort of toe the line between a collection and a novel in a way that I really like. So yeah, so Things They Carried is another one. I think everyone should probably read that one. I'm trying to think what else. There were actually a couple of books that I read that weren't about the Vietnam War, but were about World War II. One of them was Bloods, which specifically detailed the experiences of Black soldiers during World War II. And then there are lots of like little pieces that I read about Black soldiers' experiences during the Vietnam War specifically. And there is another book. I can see the cover, but I'm completely blanking on, like, I can see the words on the cover, but they're just like gibberish in my head. when I think of what it's another very famous Vietnam War novel.
Matterhorn?
Yes, I was almost there. I got the
Karl
M.
Marlantes.
Like,
Yeah, no, and I'm. It's been a minute since I read it, but I do remember it. It's
yeah,
really interesting to me because there was a moment too where the literature of Vietnam was really driving literary fiction
hmm
for a while, and then it sort of became the literature of the Gulf War, and then it
yeah,
became the literature of the war. And it's
right,
watching that evolution, right, where we've gone from the stories we told ourselves about World War II,
mhm,
and then the Korean War kind of like we got MASH out of the Korean War. Huh?
yeah,
And then suddenly there's this sort of body of literature and some really great histories, but also some biographies of some people where I'm like, oh, that's your legacy. Cool.
yeah,
A lot of, oh, that's your legacy. Cool. Were you
right,
planning that? Henry Kissinger, I'm looking at you. But
right.
but in terms of you as a writer, separate from O Sinners, who are some of the fundamental influences on you, sort of maybe even some of the people who made you think, oh, right, I am serious about this writing thing. I do want to teach this. I do want to work in this. I do want to make this sort of my thing.
Yeah. Like when I was really lucky in a sense that there was no point at which I realized that I wanted to be a writer. I
Okay.
just kind of always knew that about myself. And I really credit
Uh,
my parents for that. I grew up, they always like emphasized the importance of storytelling. They're avid readers themselves. My dad was reading his favorites, the Iliad and the Odyssey, to me when I was just a baby and couldn't understand any of this, but I could
mhm.
understand the language. I could still hear it in the voice that he would read it in. And they had this massive library. And actually, they are big fans of sci fi, fantasy, and horror. So those
Mhm.
are the genres that I started really sort of reading. They never like censored me or anything. I could read whatever I wanted from their
Mhm.
library. And so I read a lot of Stephen King when I was growing up, a lot of Tolkien, like that stuff. I was reading kind of all of those things. And so I would say that my very early influences are probably some of those fantasy, sci-fi, and horror authors. And then when I was in high school, I read Sula, Toni Morrison's Sula. And that was the first time that I can identify that I was like, oh, you can do that with that's something that I can do. And so I kind of consumed like over the course of a summer, I just consumed everything that she had written. I started it with Sula and then moved to The Bluest Eye, and then of course Beloved. And my favorite is actually Song of Solomon, and just really became a student of how is she doing that? Like,
Mhm.
and it's what I always identified with Toni Morrison was she's got this specificity. She has a way of being super specific about human experience in a way that you would never think to describe. Like I remember in one of her books, she's describing the noise that a woman makes with her teeth as she's trying to thread a needle. And I was like, wow, I would never think to describe that very small moment, but I know exactly what she's talking about. And so she was really and continues to be like one of my biggest influences in terms of just having control over my language. And if, if my students were here right now, they'd be like, oh, here she goes again. I'm always talking about being in control of your language and also just being very specific with what you want your reader to experience as they're experiencing that language that you are controlling. So that was my turning point. Shirley Jackson is another one, even though I don't write genre fiction really. I really admire the way that Shirley Jackson sort of like teeters on the line between literary fiction and horror. I think it's really so, and psychological horror specifically, I think is difficult and from a craft perspective. And I just love what she does. I think the first book that I read by her was We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And when I got to the end of that book, I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it. But when I got to the end of the book, I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Like that's amazing. Like, whoa, it kind of blew my mind completely. And so, yeah, I would say that Toni Morrison, Shirley Jackson are two of my biggest influences as far as like craft is concerned, like really understanding the power of language when you apply intention to it.
I love that when you apply intention to it. As I've said a couple of times, I followed you immediately straight through to the end, did not want to put the book down either time. And I've said this before, you read differently when you're reading to experience a thing versus reading to prep for an interview. It is two different things. And both times I discovered new stuff, or I didn't want to put it down, or I didn't want to leave these worlds that you'd created. And that is completely built out of the details. And it's completely built out of the tensions. I bought all of it. Even the horse stuff where I was like, oh, I guess we're going here. Okay. Some of the horse stuff, I was like, I'm doing a little better with Odo manipulating people than I am with the horse stuff. So clearly not meant to be out in the wild, helping horses. But at the same time, the way it all comes together, I like all of what you just, those influences, everything. I'm like, yep, totally get it. All right. Before I let you go, though, is there anything that I've missed that you really wanted to talk about with O Sinners? Because we are dancing around some pretty significant spoilers.
I know.
We're totally dancing, but I feel like we've done the thing we set out to do before you and I turned on or hit the record button. We were just like, well, here's some thoughts. I feel like we've done it, though. Yeah?
I think so.
All right. Well, then, Nicole Cuffy, this is where I say thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. O Sinners is out now. And I hope people have as good a time with this book as I did, because it was, it's just really good.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.